The air between the two cities stung like iron. It was thick with unseen particles, hovering in that nebulous space where Mekan's sterile, gleaming skyline ended and Ruston's dark, broken spires began. A line split the two like a scar. On one side, the blinding reflection of the sun bounced off Mekan's towers, pristine and alive. On the other, Ruston choked on shadows, its metal skeletons writhing under a haze of rust, orange smoke. Dr. Elara Vayne watched the border from the observation shuttle. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, hard blue eyes under perpetually furrowed brows, strands of silver hair escaping her tied-back bun. She adjusted her coat, the sharp edges of her collar brushing her jaw. Below, hundreds of freight drones moved back and forth across the border wall, a mechanical ballet ferrying goods and waste. Waste that always went into Ruston and never returned. 5 minutes to crossing, the pilot's voice crackled through the cabin. Understood. Elara's voice was steady, calm, calculated, like always. She'd already prepared herself for what she was about to see. She'd been to Ruston before, though it was long ago, before her reputation could keep her insulated in Mekan's sterile halls. Behind her, Dalen Cross muttered under his breath, his tone drenched in sarcasm. "Hope you brought a mask, Doc. Ruston air's not real friendly." Elara ignored him and stared straight ahead. Dalen's reputation preceded him, a scavenger, a fixer, a man who had seen far too much of Ruston's underbelly and survived. He was gaunt and rugged, his face like a blueprint of a hard life. Sunken cheeks, a scar running from the edge of his left brow to the corner of his jaw. He reeked of oil and something faintly metallic that never washed off, and he wore his contempt for Mekan like armor. "I don't need your commentary, Mr. Cross," Elara said, her voice clipped. "I need you to keep us alive." "That's the plan." Dalen leaned back, boots propped up on the seat across from him, hands laced behind his head. "Can't have the big brains turning into scrap heap chow now, can we?" The shuttle groaned as it descended. The smooth glide of Mekan's magnetic lifts gave way to shuddering turbulence as they entered Ruston airspace. The moment the craft crossed the border, the change was palpable, like plunging into the depths of an oil slick. The sky darkened and the rhythmic hum of the engines stuttered, fighting against the choking air. Through the window, Elara saw Ruston unfold like a festering wound. The city was alive, but not in any way that suggested comfort. Buildings leaned against one another like dying men, their surfaces mottled with rust, streaked black with the grime of centuries. Smoke poured from the industrial stacks, bleeding into the clouds. Mechanical arms jerked and spasmed atop the crumbling factories, laboring without clear purpose. Further below, the streets writhed with movement. Elara squinted and saw figures, humans, moving sluggishly among mountains of scrap metal and forgotten machinery. Their skin glistened faintly, sweat mixing with filth, the heat of the dying city baking them alive. The shuttle settled roughly onto a landing platform, the landing gear screeching like nails on glass. Outside, the ground was pockmarked with oil-slicked puddles, their surfaces shimmering like wounds torn into the earth. Dalen stood first. "Welcome to paradise." Elara followed him out of the shuttle, her boots squelching against the grime. The heat hit her like a wall. She adjusted the breathing mask clipped to her belt and fitted it over her mouth. She hadn't brought a full suit, not wanting to look weak, though Dalen clearly thought she was foolish for it. "Dr. Vayne," a deep guttural voice called to her. She turned to see a man waiting for them, his body wrapped in layers of thick, oil-stained canvas. Ruston's regional overseer. His face was hidden behind a rusted respirator mask, and his left arm was clearly mechanical, its joints clanked with every small movement, poorly maintained. He extended his metal hand. "Overseer Price," Elara said, shaking it. The arm's servos hissed. "You're late," Price grunted. "We don't have time for pleasantries. Workers are dying, and the machines, they're changing." "Changing?" Elara frowned. "You'll see soon enough." Dalen cracked his knuckles as they began to walk, a sound that echoed unnervingly across the cavernous landing bay. As they made their way into the heart of Ruston, the smell grew worse, metal and rot, and something almost sweet like spoiled meat. Elara's eyes watered beneath her mask. They passed through streets littered with bodies, not dead, but sleeping or collapsed from exhaustion. Machines twitched nearby, their metal arms jerking rhythmically, whirring sounds cutting through the silence. A factory loomed ahead, its entryway stretched into a yawning maw, rusted teeth jagged like a jaw. "Is this where it started?" Elara asked. Price stopped. "It's where the first workers disappeared." Dalen spat onto the ground. "Bet their bodies ain't gonna look too pretty." The overseer didn't answer. Instead, he swung open the heavy doors with his mechanical arm. The sound screamed like an animal. Inside, the factory was dark, except for scattered beams of flickering orange light. Shapes loomed everywhere, hulking machines, oil-drip tools, abandoned pallets. There was something else, too, something wet. Elara's flashlight swept across the room. The first body was slumped against the wall, half hidden in shadow. For a moment, she thought it was wearing armor, but then the light caught it. The man's torso was split down the center, his ribs peeled outward like a broken cage. From within, veins of metal stretched upward, twisting like growing roots into the pipes overhead. His face was frozen in horror, mouth open in a silent scream. Elara's breath caught. Dalen cursed. "What did this?" Elara whispered. Overseer Price spoke, his voice low and mechanical behind his mask. "We don't know. It's spreading. Whatever it is, it's alive." From the dark recesses of the factory, something clicked, a sound both mechanical and organic. Elara turned sharply, her flashlight catching a glimpse of movement, a long, glistening tendril sliding between gears. The sound of metal grinding against itself filled the silence. "Something's still here," Dalen muttered, hand instinctively reaching for the worn pistol strapped to his belt. The clicking grew louder. In the distance, the machines began to hum to life. The factory was a breathing tomb. Elara could hear it, something shifting, pulsing behind the steel walls, as if the building itself had grown lungs. The air inside clung to her skin, heavy and slick, saturated with oil and a faint metallic sweetness that burned the back of her throat. Dalen moved ahead of her, his flashlight bobbing in the darkness, illuminating rusted machines that twitched and hissed. The grinding noise from before had grown fainter. but it was still there, like nails scraping the inside of her skull. "This place shouldn't be alive," Dalen muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Machines don't do this." Elara ignored him, focusing on the scene unfolding in front of them. The further they moved into the factory, the more unnatural the environment became. Machines weren't simply broken, they were twisted. Conveyor belts slithered across the floor like worms, gears spun in jagged bursts, and the walls bulged with strange growths of metallic spines and tissue, as if the factory had started to digest itself. "Watch your step," Dalen warned as he grabbed Elara's arm. She hadn't even noticed the floor had changed. It was no longer solid metal, but an uneven, pulsing surface. Looking closer, Elara saw clusters of black material growing like tumors from the grating, slick and veined with something red coursing through them. She crouched and ran her gloved fingers over it. It was warm. Organic. "This is biological," she murmured. "But it's fusing with the metal. It's impossible." "Yeah? Tell that to him." Dalen angled his flashlight toward the far corner of the room. The body was barely recognizable. It was one of Ruston's workers, but his flesh had been overtaken. His limbs were stretched and contorted into sharp angles, bones replaced by metallic rods that jutted out of his skin like grotesque scaffolding. His chest cavity had split wide open, and from within, black tendrils spilled out, weaving upward and into the ceiling like invasive roots. His face was the worst, a frozen expression of agony, his mouth locked in a silent scream, while fragments of steel erupted from his jaw and cheekbones. The veins in his neck bulged, blackened and rigid, like cables under his skin. Elara's stomach twisted. How is this even possible? It's rewriting his biology. Dalen turned his head away, his face pale beneath the grime. "It's not just happening to people. Look." Elara followed his flashlight beam to the machines. What she'd first thought were broken parts were, in fact, growing. Black tendrils snaked through the gears, pulsing like blood vessels. Tools and engines fused together into monstrous shapes. Pistons became crude limbs, turbines twisted into rib cages, and panels warped into something resembling flesh. Machines that had been inanimate for years seemed to hum faintly, as though they were breathing. "This factory's infected," Dalen said. "It's spreading. You think the rest of Ruston looks like this?" Elara pushed away the rising panic. "Not yet. But if it reaches the city's main infrastructure..." A sharp click cut her off. Both flashlights swung toward the sound, catching movement in the shadows. Something slithered between the pipes above them, long, dark, and wet. The grinding noise returned, louder this time, echoing through the factory walls. "Did you see that?" Dalen hissed. "Yes." Elara's voice was low, steady. "Keep moving." They edged deeper into the factory, their footsteps muffled against the spongy, pulsing floor. Elara could feel the tremors beneath her boots, like something alive just below the surface. Dalen scanned the catwalk above with his flashlight, but it only revealed more of the same, steel overtaken by black, fleshy growths, the walls weeping dark liquid that reeked of blood and oil. A scream tore through the silence. Dalen spun around. "That's Harvin!" They ran toward the sound, Elara's heartbeat hammering in her chest. The grinding grew louder as they turned a corner and found Harvin, one of their team members, pinned to the floor. Black tendrils had erupted from the walls, wrapping around his legs and torso, dragging him backward into the darkness. He screamed again, his eyes wide with terror as the tendrils pierced his skin, burrowing deep into his flesh. "Help me!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Oh God, it's inside me!" Dalen moved to grab him, but Elara pulled him back. "No!" Harvin's body convulsed violently as the tendrils overtook him. His chest rippled, the skin stretching unnaturally as something writhed beneath it. His screams became gurgles as his throat bulged, veins blackening. Suddenly, his jaw unhinged with a sickening crack, and something pushed its way out. Jagged metal spikes, glistening with blood. His ribs split outward like petals, revealing black, pulsing tissue intertwined with steel. Dalen stumbled back, his face white with horror. We can't stay here." Harvin's body spasmed once more before falling still, his head tilted unnaturally, eyes wide and vacant. The tendrils released him, slithering back into the shadows. The grinding noise subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. Elara forced herself to look away. "It's transforming them," she whispered. "The organism, whatever it is, it's consuming both flesh and metal." "And we're next if we don't move," Dalen snapped. They continued through the factory, their flashlights barely penetrating the growing darkness. Elara felt the walls closing in, the air growing thicker, heavier. She could hear it now, beneath the hum of machines, a wet, clicking rhythm like an animal waiting in the dark. "It's spreading faster," she said, her voice shaking. "This isn't natural. It's intelligent." Dalen stopped and turned to her, his eyes wild. "What are you saying? It's alive?" Before Elara could answer, the floor beneath them buckled. They stumbled as black tendrils burst upward, writhing toward them. One snaked around Elara's ankle, burning through her boot as she screamed and kicked it free. "Run!" Dalen shouted. They sprinted for the exit, the factory erupting around them. Machines twisted and groaned, parts snapping as tendrils dragged them into the walls. The grinding noise grew deafening, rising into a metallic howl. Elara risked a glance behind her and saw it. The thing, or at least part of it. A mass of tendrils and spines, dripping with oil and blood, crawling through the machines like a grotesque spider. Its surface rippled, faces and limbs pressing out before being reabsorbed, as though it had consumed hundreds of bodies and carried them all within. They burst through the doors into the open air, stumbling onto the landing platform. Dalen slammed the controls to seal the factory. The grinding noise continued behind the walls, louder than ever. Elara bent over, gasping for breath, her ankle throbbing. She looked up at Dalen, whose face was twisted in a mix of anger and fear. "What the hell is that?" he demanded. Elara stared back at the factory, the walls pulsing faintly as though alive. "I don't know," she whispered, "but it's spreading." The tunnel stretched downward like a throat, its walls slick and glistening with black filth that pulsed faintly, almost as if it were alive. The light from Elara's flashlight barely cut through the suffocating dark, illuminating only wet metal and tangled masses of sinewy growths. Every step echoed, swallowed quickly by the heavy air. Behind her, Dalen and Mira moved in silence, their faces pale, their breaths shallow under the rebreathers they wore. "Are you sure this leads to something?" Dalen muttered. His voice was low, but the sound carried, bouncing off the tunnel walls. "It feels like we're walking straight into its mouth." Elara didn't look back. "The organism is intelligent. It's expanding, consuming everything above and spreading downward. There has to be a core, something central that's controlling this infection. We need to find it and destroy it. And if it finds us first," Mira whispered. Her voice trembled, the horror of Harvin's fate still etched into her face. Elara didn't answer. She focused on the descent, pushing past her own fear. They had left the factory hours ago and discovered the tunnel beneath a collapsed maintenance shaft. It looked like something had dug into the earth, a path bored through layers of steel and stone, leading deep below the surface. The further they went, the stranger the air became. Warmer, thick with moisture and the stench of decay. As they moved, the walls changed. The steel infrastructure of Ruston gave way to something organic. Black tendrils, like roots, emerged from every surface, weaving through metal panels and pulsing with faint light. Some were the thickness of her arm, others stretched like wires converging toward the unseen depths. Elara crouched and ran her gloved hand across the floor. The surface was spongy and warm, a texture that turned her stomach. "This is it," she murmured. "We're close." Dalen's flashlight flickered and he smacked it against his hand. "Feels like we've been down here forever. How far does this thing go?" Before Elara could respond, a distant sound rumbled through the tunnel, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. It vibrated through the walls, setting the tendrils to twitching. The noise grew louder, closer, as though the earth itself was breathing. Mira flinched. "It knows we're here." The tunnel opened suddenly into a cavern, vast and cathedral-like, its ceiling disappearing into shadow. Elara froze, her flashlight sweeping the space. The walls were alive, completely overtaken by the black growths, which pulsed and expanded like an enormous living lung. The ground rippled underfoot, soft and slick with some kind of secretion that oozed between the roots. In the center of the cavern stood something monstrous, a massive pulsating hive built from a fusion of metal and flesh. The structure loomed over them, its surface crawling with movement, coils of black tendrils winding and unwinding like serpents, metallic limbs twitching sporadically as though trying to assemble themselves. It was alive and it was growing, the pulsing light inside casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. "Oh my God," Mira whispered, her voice shaking. Dalen raised his pistol reflexively, though they all knew it would do no good. "That's the heart, isn't it?" Elara nodded, her mouth dry. "The nest." As they edged closer, Elara's flashlight revealed the full horror. Bodies, hundreds of them, fused into the base of the hive. Men, women, and machines twisted together in grotesque shapes. Rib cages were pulled open to reveal networks of metal and tissue inside. Bones had been replaced with rods and gears, and faces stared blankly outward, their mouths frozen mid-scream. Some of the bodies still twitched, their movements mechanical, inhuman, as though the creature refused to let them die. Mira stumbled backward, gagging behind her mask. How can it do this?" Elara's mind reeled, but her voice remained steady. "It's adapting. The organism is symbiotic. It doesn't destroy, it repurposes. It's turning flesh and machinery into something new. Dalen's grip on his gun tightened. This isn't evolution. This is a nightmare. The rumbling heartbeat grew louder, and the nest began to shift. The tendrils coiled inward, pulling at the bodies, reshaping parts of the structure as if reacting to their presence. A deep clicking sound echoed through the cavern, rhythmic and purposeful. "It knows we're here," Elara said. "It's aware of us." Before they could move, the ground erupted. Tendrils shot upward, thick and slick, bursting from the floor like the roots of an ancient tree. One wrapped around Mira's leg and yanked her backward, her scream cutting through the cavern. "Mira!" Elara shouted, lunging toward her. Mira hit the ground hard, thrashing, clawing at the tendrils wrapped around her legs and torso. Her flashlight spun across the floor, casting wild beams of light. Dalen grabbed her arms, pulling as hard as he could. The tendrils fought back, writhing and twisting, pulling her closer to the hive. "It's in me," Mira screamed suddenly, her voice choking with pain. Elara froze as she saw it. Black veins were spreading across Mira's face, her skin blistering and splitting. Her eyes turned glassy as her body convulsed, sharp spikes of metal bursting from her ribs and shoulders. Dalen stumbled back, dragging Elara with him. "She's gone. We have to go, now!" Mira's body jerked upward, her mouth splitting open as a sound escaped, a wet, grinding click. The tendrils lifted her, pulling her into the hive. The surface swallowed her whole, absorbing her into its shifting mass. The hive groaned, the bodies fused to it, twitching as if in response. Elara turned to Dalen, her voice shaking. "We can't stop it from here. We need to find the central point, the brain. If we destroy that, maybe we can kill it. And if we can't, then there won't be a Ruston left to save." The rumbling heartbeat grew deafening as they ran, the ground heaving beneath their feet. Tendrils burst from the walls and floor, snaking after them, reaching with blind purpose. Elara could hear the creature behind her, moving, the walls groaning and shifting as it pursued them. They found another tunnel, narrow, carved directly into the earth, and sprinted into it, the light from the cavern behind them growing faint. The tendrils slowed their pursuit, as though the creature was herding them. The tunnel curved downward, the air growing hotter, and Elara's flashlight flickered as though resisting the oppressive darkness. They emerged into a smaller chamber. It was smoother, quieter, and the tendrils were denser, converging into a single mass at the center of the room. The brain of the nest. It pulsed rhythmically, dark liquid dripping from it like blood. Elara turned to Dalen. "This is it." Dalen stared at the mass, his face grim. "Then let's end this." As Elara prepared the explosives strapped to her belt, the tendrils shifted, retracting slowly into the walls. The room trembled as the brain opened, a gaping wound of black tendrils and pulsing tissue. From within, something stepped out, a form vaguely human, draped in black growth, its body fused with metal. It looked at them, empty eye sockets glowing faintly, and the clicking sound began again, echoing through the chamber. Elara's hands shook as she armed the device. "We don't have much time." The creature took a step toward them. The walls of the chamber trembled as the figure stepped closer. It was human in shape, but so far removed from humanity that the sight of it turned Elara's stomach. Its body was a grotesque fusion of metal and flesh, its limbs elongated and sharp, its torso stretched thin, with jagged steel ribs visible beneath black, pulsing skin. The face was the worst of all, smooth and eyeless, its jaw unhinged and twisted into a yawning maw that clicked rhythmically, emitting the same grinding sound that had haunted them for hours. It was alive and it was watching them. Dalen raised his pistol with shaking hands and fired. The shots rang out in quick succession, the flashes lighting up the chamber, but the bullets struck the creature with sickening thuds, sinking into its flesh like stones into tar. It didn't slow. It absorbed them. "Dalen," Elara shouted. "Forget it. Help me arm the charge." Dalen cursed under his breath, holstering the useless weapon. The thing moved toward them with a deliberate, inhuman grace, its long arms dragging against the ground, leaving slick trails of black ichor. Behind it, the mass at the chamber's center, the brain, pulsed violently, tendrils retracting and slithering into the walls like a giant organism bracing itself. The entire room seemed to be coming alive, shifting and shuddering with anticipation. Elara ripped open the small pack on her belt, hands fumbling as she pulled out the device, a compact, high-yield explosive scavenged from Mekan's energy cores. It wasn't designed for something like this. It wasn't designed for anything alive, but it would have to work. "This'll vaporize everything in a 10-block radius," she said, her voice breathless. "If we can set it at the base of the brain, it'll destroy the nest. And us," Dalen muttered. Elara glanced at him. "You think we're walking out of here alive?" the creature shrieked. It was a sound no living thing should make, a metallic howl that seemed to vibrate inside their bones. It launched itself forward, impossibly fast, its arms snapping outward like spears. Dalen grabbed Elara's arm and yanked her to the side as the creature crashed into the floor where they had stood, sending shards of metal and black sludge into the air. "Move!" Dalen shouted. They scrambled toward the center of the room, toward the pulsating core. The ground beneath them rippled like liquid, tendrils bursting upward, trying to ensnare their ankles. Dalen slashed at them with his knife, black ichor spattering across his face, but Elara ignored it all, her eyes locked on the center. The brain was enormous up close, a writhing, living thing built from steel, bone, and organic tissue. It pulsed in sync with the deep, deafening heartbeat that filled the chamber, veins of dark liquid coursing across its surface like a circulatory system. The tendrils that extended from it quivered, as if sensing her presence. Elara didn't hesitate. She knelt at its base, pulling wires from the explosive with trembling fingers. "Cover me!" she screamed. Dalen turned to face the creature as it reoriented itself, its eyeless face twitching toward them. It shrieked again, its limbs splitting open, revealing spiked appendages that glistened with blood and oil. Dalen roared and charged at it, knife in hand, slicing at the tendrils that lashed toward him. Elara's mind was a blur. She connected the detonator wires to the base of the device, fingers numb, sweat dripping into her eyes. The ground shifted beneath her as the brain shuddered, sensing the intrusion. A tendril shot forward, wrapping around her wrist like a vice. the flesh searing where it touched her skin. She screamed, her other hand scrambling for her knife, slicing through the tendril. Black fluid splattered across her coat, burning through the fabric. "Almost there," she whispered to herself, forcing the words through clenched teeth. "Elara!" Dalen's voice rang out. She looked up just in time to see him thrown across the chamber, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the ground, motionless. The creature loomed over him, its long arms twitching as it angled its head toward Elara. It knew what she was doing. "No," Elara breathed. "Stay away." The creature screeched and lunged toward her. Elara jammed the final wire into place and slammed her hand onto the detonator. A countdown started, a digital display blinking red. 15, 14. The tendrils lashed out, wrapping around her ankles and waist, dragging her backward as the creature closed the distance. She clawed at the ground, trying to pull herself free, but the pressure on her ribs was unbearable. The creature loomed over her, its face mere inches from hers, and for the first time Elara felt it, not just its presence, but its intent. It wasn't mindless, it was ancient and deliberate, and it was hungry. She reached for her belt and ripped free a small flare, snapping it to life. The bright red light illuminated the room, casting the creature in a monstrous silhouette. Its limbs recoiled momentarily, and Elara used the distraction to pull herself forward, dragging her body inch by inch toward the explosive. The countdown blinked. 5, 4. She looked back at Dalen, who was coughing, blood dripping from his mouth as he struggled to his feet. He met her eyes, and in that moment she knew they wouldn't escape. "Elara!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Go!" But she didn't. She crawled closer to the explosive, ignoring the pain, ignoring the creature's screeching roar behind her. She slammed her palm against the final trigger. Manual override activated. The countdown froze. The explosive's core hummed violently, energy building, vibrating the air. The brain thrashed, tendrils retracting, walls collapsing inward as though it was trying to protect itself. The creature let out one final, ear-splitting scream that reverberated through the chamber. Elara closed her eyes. The explosion hit like the end of the world. A blinding white light consumed everything, followed by a shock wave that tore through the cavern. The ground split open. The brain imploded, its tendrils flailing wildly before disintegrating into ash. The creature screamed, its form disintegrating, its metallic limbs shattering like glass. For a moment, there was silence, and then the world collapsed. Elara woke to pain and darkness. She was buried beneath rubble, her limbs numb and her lungs filled with smoke. Light filtered down from somewhere above, dim and red. She coughed, the taste of blood thick on her tongue. Groaning, she pushed her way free, crawling through broken stone and twisted metal. When she emerged, the sight before her stole what little breath she had left. The cavern was gone, obliterated. Above, the surface of Ruston was visible, but it was no longer the city she remembered. Massive cracks split the earth, and black tendrils still writhed faintly from below, twitching as though refusing to die. The air stank of ash and burning metal, and the horizon was lit with fires. Dalen lay a few feet away, motionless. Elara crawled toward him, shaking him gently. Dalen, Dalen, wake up! He coughed, opening one eye. Blood stained his teeth. Did we win? Elara looked around them. The broken earth, the faint twitching tendrils, the sky dark with smoke. She thought of the hive's final scream, the intelligence that had fought them until the end. I don't know, she whispered. Above them, the ground rumbled faintly, as though something deep below had simply gone quiet, waiting. Elara slumped onto her side, staring at the cracked sky. It's not over,